we're doing just for today and next week, I'm doing a 2-week series on the Talmud. And then we go back to our usual thing. And I've got people from kids class and James class, and so that's why we set up here because I told you going to show up. Now, first question. How many of you know what Talmud is? Okay, what is it? Okay, Barbie, what is it?
It's Jewish interpretation of the first 5 books of Bible, Torah, I believe, isn't it? I had to
Close. You're in the ballpark. Somebody else got it. Off. Be more specific. Oh, good. Okay. It's the oral law. The Torah is the written law. How many laws there is Torah? 613 written laws in the Torah. Oh, shoot. And a lot of them are very challenging to understand. And so over the centuries, over the millennia, actually, rabbis have studied and discussed and studied and discussed some more. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And so we've got the Campbells and Nancy. Good morning, y'all. Good morning, y'all. If you have a question, shout it out. Because if you like me, if you wait loud, you should come back to it. You won't remember what it is. I don't remember where I was. Most of the class, let me tell you how I got started with this. Tom keeps a real close eye on Chesterfield County Library System and their new acquisitions. And they recently acquired from Chesterfield County Library System the Talmud for Dummies. And so not only as well as he does, he checked it out for me. And I read it and was fascinated by it. Said this would be a cool Sunday school class. So that's why we're doing this. So my sources, in addition to the Talmud Dummies, are a couple of different places online. Wikipedia, obviously. But also there are a couple of Jewish sources online. So that's where all this is coming. So you're going to have to excuse me, but I'm going to do a fair amount of reading, otherwise this won't make a lot of sense. So the Talmud, which means teaching, is the central text of rabbinic Judaism, and it's the primary source of Jewish religious law and theology. It consists of the oral Torah and its commentaries. So the oral Torah itself, the law itself, is called a Mishnah, and the commentary is called a Gemara. And there's more stuff about it. It records the teachings, opinions, disagreements of thousands of rabbis. So it came together over centuries with input on all kinds of subjects, including ethics, philosophy, customs, history, and book. Until the 18th and 19th centuries, the Talmud was the central piece of their culture. It told them how to do everything. Served as, this one person says, it's the guide for the daily life of Jews. So the oral law is a legal commentary on Torah, explaining how the commandments are to be carried out. Common sense says that you're going to need something, and they have a tradition about how it came to be. This is a classic statement of their belief of how the Talmud came to be. The authority of the oral Torah is found in the first Mishnah. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the General Assembly. And this was meant to establish that the traditions practiced during this time were not human creations, but trace their authority back to Mount Sinai. So it has been handed down orally until fairly recently, well, I won't say fairly recently, but for centuries, it was handed down orally. It was not written. For a while, it was considered sacrilegious to write it. We'll get to the way about it soon. Okay. So, for example, if one looks at the specific biblical laws regulating how to observe the Sabbath, one finds only injunctions against lighting a fire, going away from one's dwelling, cutting down a tree, plowing, harvesting, would merely refraining from these few activities filled with biblical commands to make the Sabbath holy. And cutting down trees is not something to worry about anyway. Indeed, the Sabbath rituals that are most commonly associated with holiness are not found in the Torah. They're found in the oral law. So without an oral tradition, some of the Torah's laws would be comprehensible. So this is something from the Torah. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. Okay, here's what I want you to really listen to. And you shall bind them for a sign on your hand, and they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. And the commentary here says the word frontlet is as obscure in Hebrew as it is in English. Do you have any idea what a frontlet is? It's a Wikipedia. So, what they have come up with is that, the frontlet is a little box. And that there are 4 scriptures, and the oral law has determined what the scriptures are, and they are placed on the fold. And there is also something put on the hand during time of prayer. Obviously, you'll have to walk out and put a box on the holy law. So the oral law is also needed to mitigate certain category Torah laws that would cause great problems if they carried out literally, such as an eye for an eye. I mean, that sounds like if you damage my eye, I get to your eye. The oral law expands on that and says, no, that's fear. But if you damage my eye, you owe me money to the value of mine. But if you read the Torah literally, it would be good. The Jewish community in Palestine suffered tremendous losses during the Great Revolt, and later I'm going to go through the history with dates toward the end of the period. Well over 1 million Jews were killed for these 2 practices, along with thousands of others who were devastated, displaced, run out of their homes. And so in about the year 200, after these revolts, one of the rabbis, Rabbi Judah Prince, decided that maybe we should make down the whole law, because all of those teachers who had it in their heads, a lot of them just died. So we're losing that continuity. It needs to be written down. So he wrote down the Mishnah, which is the central part of the Talmud. That is the law. So the Mishnah is in 6 sections, and then each section has subcategories, which are called tractates. And there are 63 tractates. I collect books. I have a little bit of its own, but library. So I thought, it'd be cool to read the Torah. This is before I did all this research and knew what I was getting into. So I'm like, Amazon. 63 volumes, over 1,000 dollars. I decided I didn't want this. Now, the advantage to the Talmud over the Torah is that it is categorized. In the Torah, for example, if you want to know all the laws about any item, you've got to read the whole Torah, because they're everywhere. There are multiple books. The Talmud is by category. It is very well organized with subsections, much easier to find things.
Sarah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
If it's a large collection, as you said, how did that one guy have all that in his head? I can't remember. How does that one guy keep all that?
That's how they taught and learned. And in fact, one of the reasons for not writing it down was to force the students to keep a close relationship to it. And then the students became teachers next, and they taught, and they're just, they were passionate, and I think something they said, well, they were just passionate about the law. And so I've seen one, translation of Mishnah to me, repeat. I mean, how many verses do you know by heart? Because you repeated it over in your childhood. Everybody in here could tell me what John 3:16 is without thinking about it. They did it more with just numbers. And that's how. Now, they also, it was not always, their teachers and leaders of their schools did not always make money from this. They had other values. And this was not necessarily a career the way we think of teaching. So the 6 orders is then they're divided into the brackets. So the 6 orders are called seed. The first one is seeds because back then their culture was agriculture. And next week I will pick some specific things to get we'll get into what the law is. Then you have damages, talking about civil and criminal law. There is one whole order dealing with women. It's a problem. So they need a bunch of laws. A 5th order that was supposed to be. Better sitting here going. The 5th order outlines the laws of sacrifice and ritual slaughter. And the 6th order contains laws about purity. Although parts of the Mishnah read as dry recitations, Rabbi Judah, who was the panel, wrote it down first, frequently allowed the text by presenting minority views, which it also might serve to guide scholars in literature questions. In one famous instance, the legal code almost turned poetic, as Rabbi Judah cited the point the poetic judges delivered to witnesses testifying in capital cases. During the centuries following Rabbi Judah's editing of Mishnah, it was studied exhaustively by generation after generation of rabbis. Eventually, some of these rabbis wrote down the discussions and commentaries on the Mishnah laws in a series of books known as the Talmud. The rabbis Palestinian edited their discussions of the Mishnah about the year 400. Their work became known as the Palestinian Talmud. More than a century later, some of the leading Babylonian rabbis compiled another editing of discussions of Mishnah. By then, deliberations had been going on some 300 years, so they had 300 years of discussions. And you've got the Mishnah. I had a picture on that. If you look at it on paper, the middle of it is the Mishnah, the law, and it's a very small word page. And then the Gemara, which is the commentary, is written around it, and it wasn't translated in other languages until after most of us were born. You can be able to read ancient Hebrew and Arabic. But that was one of the really fascinating things. 1965 was one of the first English editions. Think about that. Jewish scholars have got to be able to read ancient Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew did not have vowels, not usually. So think about that. So you ended up with 2 different Talmuds. There was one that was developed in Palestine, in Palestine. They call it the Jerusalem Talmud, but it wasn't actually in Jerusalem because when the Romans came in and obliterated Jerusalem, the Jews scattered. Now, a whole lot of the Jewish people ended up in what we call Babylonia, Babylon, and Old Testament, very systematic. So their culture, the whole community just moved. So the Mishnah that was created in Jerusalem, the 2 Mishnahs, where they both have the same order, they're word for word. But they don't all have just all the same stuff. The one in Palestine is much more complete in terms of agricultural items because their culture was more land-based than people lived back. So the Babylon Talmud, when you hear the word the Talmud, you're probably talking about the Babylon Talmud, because that one is much more deep, it's more detailed. The two rabbis that put it together spent over 50 years to compile. So, and it wasn't just they could help from other. So very, very thorough. Like I said, 63 volumes. So the Talmud's discussions are recorded in the system. Often the Mishnah is cited, and then that is followed by rabbinic deliberations on meaning. The Mishnah and the discussions, which are known as the Gemara, rise Talmud. Although in Jewish life, sometimes you'll get two words, Gemara and Talmud, interchangeably. So then, so you've got the Mishnah, you've got the Gemara around it, and then you've got discussions around that. And what they're doing with those discussions is presenting all sides of the argument. I mean, just think about the people in this room. If I said I want to change the name of today to, say Cricket's Day, I have 10 different opinions here. All those opinions are written down. And then in the later editions, when different publishers published it, they would add their own commentary. So when you look at a full page of Talmud, there's all kinds of stuff. So are those editions still being this commentary? Not to the Mishnah. The Mishnah was pretty much there. But then you got the Gemara, and the Gemara is pretty fluid. And then the Tosafot, which is the stuff around the Gemara, Tosafot is even more fluid. So every time there is a new petition, there's new commentary. And in some ways that sounds radical, but then I think about the study Bibles I have at home, and every time there's a new translation, the footnotes are different. There's a new commentary in the Bible, so maybe this isn't as radical as it sounds.
Is it, do you think that it's, okay, here's the law. And the Gemara is trying to understand what exactly the law meant.
Yes.
Like, it's good to have the law, but we've got to figure out what that means and how it's going to apply to us.
Right.
And it's as different as all of us are. It's
Yeah,
going to have a
yes.
different interpretation of each of us. So then that's this part.
And they're great debaters. They will argue with each other, I think, just and so those arguments are in the Talmud, and they do something as a way of making a point, which I'm still not sure I understand. They will take a point and take it as far out as they can until it's got to be ridiculous, just to make the point. I'm not sure how that makes a point or doesn't make a point, but that's something that they do. Now, sorry, yes.
Where these oral calls with a son,
Now that's an excellent question.
because I don't know a whole lot about your services. And
Now, in the services, yes, but this is the more study and sleep. So I'm not sure.
in a lot of oral traditions, I think it's kind of like memorizing music.
Right, it's easier to remember.
64 folks were said, so it's broken in chat. It's kind of like saying, let's play part 4.
Yeah,
The way to memorize it, sometimes
It's the
it's
same.
vocalizing in certain languages. Vocalization means something. If your voice raises up, it's one thing. The same word going down means it's not.
awesome. Yeah.
And I'm sure that they use, because I know that with the oral tradition of telling something, they use a lot of different literary devices like rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, all this, so that's like a book to hang your memory on.
Right.
So that would tell it, if you can get the first couple of words going, kind of like a song.
Yeah.
Like I remember words to a song better if I hear music than if I just have to conjure them out of my head.
Right.
You know, so if you've got these different, you know, literary devices, I can hang my hat on those, then I can remember the story or the law.
It's very, very possible. Because I know, and I still know, she does it, she probably knows every word, every verse of half the songs in her. All you have to do is play the first two notes and she can sing. But I bet if you ask her to say it, I bet she'll have trouble. Okay, now, I've been talking about rabbis and their students, but the Jewish law is studied by everybody. It's not just set aside for a few special people. Everybody, and at this point, I'm talking, let's face it, it's a patriarchal society. But I have this paragraph in particular really struck me. Among religious Jews, talented scholars are regarded with the same awe and respect with which secular society regards notable audience. Yet throughout Jewish history, study of the Mishnah and Talmud was hardly restricted to intellectual elite. An old book saved from millions that were burned by the Nazis is now housed at the Depot Library in New York, bears this stamp: the Society of Woodchoppers for the Study of Mishnah and Vertebrate. So there was a society of people in the country still living who had their own company. So they would study. So anybody that had an interest, they were encouraged. Yeah, you're gonna have to talk about that. Because when we get to the limit, I'll specify that.
But that probably evolved because back when it was first being written, 400 was it BC or 800?
This is, it didn't get written until after the fall of the temple, because that's when they decided it needed to be, because something would be lost, the destruction of Romans. What about Romans? So 70 AD, when the Romans came in and took it, there were a couple of revolts after that period, and in those two revolts that come into maybe 100 or 200 CE, they lost so much of the population that that's when they decided it needed to be written.
So it's after Christ.
Yes.
But the point I was gonna make is that at that time, probably the only people who could read were the educated, so the scholars, but as time went on, and more people learned how to read.
Yeah.
They-
But as long as, you know, as long as it's just a whole,
Yeah.
anybody.
Anybody. Yeah, it's true.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And this is a huge oversimplification, I know that. So am I understanding that they would, that at the very beginning of all this, they took like, remember the Sabbath and keep it off. And then rabbis decided what that meant. It meant not cutting down a tree, not mowing your lawn, that sort of.
And next week, I'm gonna get into the beer, that's gonna be one of the things I talk about, is, you know, because it's not just what you can't do, it's what you should do. And just off the top of my head, you should eat your best food on the Sabbath. You should wear your best clothes. Now, we all grew up where you had your Sunday best. You wore your best to church as a sign of respect to God. And I admit that I'm old enough that I grit my teeth when I walk into church sometimes. Well, no, in front of that. But you did, it wasn't just you can't, but you also, you must on this other side. Okay, now.
Have you gotten in trouble, right? If did not follow all these laws, like there was a punishable offense if you got caught.
Well, if you committed a sin, and there were various levels of how bad punishment was. Remember that their worship centered around the temple, and part of that was they would sacrifice for the sins you had committed. And so, you know, if you had committed a little sin, small, I guess if you took a big sin, you know. So they had that whole, and I'm certainly not an expert, but they had a whole system of sacrifices tied to the sins for your forgiveness.
Shouting all, shout out.
I haven't read that, I'm not sure. But it's certainly possible. And I don't know if I remember this from reading Jewish stuff or Amish stuff, but shunning could be permanent or it could be temporary. And it depended on how serious the infraction as to how long the shunning was.
Well, I mean, you hear it in the Gospels, when people weren't living clean lives, then you walked on the other side of the street. You know, you didn't associate that.
Which is where our parents got the saying, birds of a feather flock together, you're judged by the people you associate with. I don't like that friend you have, you can't be with that person anymore. Right? Y'all all heard this growing up. That's where it comes from. So when most people think of Torah, now changing sources here, so I'll try not to confuse stuff. Y'all keep an eye on time because I'm when most people think of Torah, they probably imagine the scroll read each week in the synagogue. But that scroll, which consists of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is only part of what Jews need when they prefer Torah. The scroll read in the synagogue consists of the first 5 books. But there's the oral Torah. The oral Torah is crucial to the normative practice of Judaism today. The prescriptions, daily life found in the Bible, typically cryptic, vague, and even contradictory. Some are completely indecipherable on their own. The oral law expands to a great length on these sources, providing vast literature that translates scriptural sources into a guide for daily living. And one of these laws, both Exodus and Deuteronomy, it is forbidden to boil a kid in slaughter's milk. That's it. So does that just mean you can't boil a young goat in the goat's milk? Or, and this is where the oral law comes in, are you allowed to mix meat dishes with dairy dishes? No. Not only can you not mix meat and dairy in the same dish, you can't have them on the same plate. You cannot cook them in the same pot. And it's my understanding that I learned this years ago that so you got 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of pots, that at least with the dishes, you had a separate set of meat dishes and dairy dishes for the Sabbath, because you use your best dishes for the Sabbath and your everyday dishes the rest of the week. So fully observant Jews, I don't know if this one is not, have 4 sets of dishes.
So now on HGTV, they will do a kitchen for a Jewish couple, and they had to accommodate all of those rules. Big.
Yeah, do you remember the antithesis pots?
Yes, all that stuff.
They wash the pots in the same sink.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Essentially, it's one room with 4 kitchens.
Yeah,
It's
it's
that way it worked out. It reminds me of the laws that we have now. You can't tie your horse up in front of the post office, something like that. You really have rules that are still on the book that should have been erased long ago. This is supposed to be so basic. Basic, 7 years ago. Orthodox.
right. Yeah, so you got, I mean, Jewish, they don't have as many varieties of Judaism as we do Christianity, but you have Orthodox that folks who do follow all of the rules of the letter, and then you've got Reform who are a lot more liberal, and then you've got liberal Jews that pretty much follow the.
And when they were house hunting, you had people within walking distance of the synagogue.
Right, because you can't drive on the same.
And it was only was last thing.
Yeah, so when you see kosher foods in the grocery stores, that means they've been prepared in accordance with Jewish law.
Yes,
And blessed.
and less. Yes.
Wow.
And one of the 6 categories where you've got different chapters is blessings. They bless everything. How many of you, I'm gonna do a commercial here, how many of you watched the television show The Chosen?
Oh, yes.
I highly recommend it. You know your Bible well enough to know that the logic you can go, okay, that's biblical, this thing, that question out. But it makes the life that period real. I highly recommend it if you've got whatever period. Yeah.
So out of all these teachings and these laws, with Christ, what did he teach? You know, what did he say? We don't need that anymore. It was, power.
Right, well, one thing I remember that he said was that the law was for man, not man. So he was on the good side of, you know, if you're starving, it's okay to eat on that.
I mean, is there thing to set free from the law? Like, like I'm not saying, the two greatest laws are from the Lord God and all. So I'm saying it's like to this, love your people as yourself. And that to him, all the law boiled down to those two.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna hopefully not give you too much, but I wanted to give you this, with dates, not real specific dates in terms of what happened with, to give you a feel for the destruction of the temple all the way up to today. So the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And they totally redid Judaism at that point because their religion evolved from the temple. Then the Theophilus School was established as a center for Jewish learning at the city of Theophilus. Then in 132, so 60 years later, we have the Roman Emperor Hadrian. He didn't like the Jews. He passed a whole lot of laws restricting what the Jews what they could not do. So 3 years after he passes all these laws, they have their first revolt. And of course, you don't revolt against Rome and come out of it unscathed. 3 years after the revolt, Hadrian died. His successor said that was too much, like loyal. Then in 200, I've already talked about Rabbi Judah the Prince. He compiles the Mishnah. And then the Amalaic period starts. And this is when they start producing a body of teachings dedicated to explaining the Mishnah and adding the recollections. Then about 20 years later, a school opened in the Babylonian city of Surah. And this played a big part in what comes later. And then there's another academy. But at the same time, and they had 2 different ways of looking at Torah. And one school was a little more loosey-goosey, and the other school was rigid. And they both thought the other was wrong. But we had both chains of thought. Then in somewhere in between the 3rd and 5th century, the Talmud, then they start making, and that takes 2 or 3 centuries. And so that's where it really got right. And then you have 200, 600, while this was happening, the hair culture also played. It wasn't just a Jewish fact. Now, up until this point, everything was in the book. And then in the 4th, 5th century, Rashi and Medina were 2 sages and write all this stuff down. And then through the 11th century, you've got people commentaries. The 12th and 13th century, you get more commentary that's added to it. And then the printing press made life easier. But like I said earlier, in 1965, a rabbi in the United States began a project that took me 45 years to complete. It was the translation of your mature Aramaic into modern Hebrew. And then, that same year, so mid-60s, it was translated into Jersey, in English. And next week, what I'm gonna do is actually look at specific laws. I'm gonna talk about how you keep the Sabbath, purity laws, and anything else that. But anyway, so now you know what it is, and hopefully you'll come back next week, because I have a so